Exposition. This is our theme today. Listen carefully. Human beings being born, living life, and dying as humans being. Like a theme in a musical composition, it will return and develop and return again. This first section may be called an exposition outlining the theme with two movements. The first is entitled My Work, and the second is entitled Your Work. And then the whole composition is completed by a recapitulation or coda. So please relax and get comfortable. Human beings being born, living life, and dying as humans being. Human beings being born, living life, and dying as humans being. I may be a doctor, but there isn't a thing about living and dying that's intrinsically medical. Some 108 billion of us humans have walked this planet, and about 7 billion of us, transiently, live now. About 200,000 of us will die today and every day. Only the tiniest fraction of a percent of these human beings have needed a Western medical model to live and to die. Almost none of us needed anything more than the technology of the household and the village. Almost all of our ancestors were born and died at home, assisted by their families and community members. Today, in some places in the U.S., the rate of cesarean section is higher than 60%. And those dying in hospitals averages 25%, but is sometimes as high as a half. Is it better today? Is it true that humans have lived before us and died before us? They had it worse? Was it worse before the imperfect and terribly flawed medical apparatus was available to the small percentage of us that live in the West and have precious access and insurance? Perhaps it's not true. Perhaps it's the same as it ever was. Or worse. Perhaps we've made it worse. Human beings being born, living life, and dying as humans being. Now, I may be a consumer, but there isn't a thing about living and dying that's intrinsically economic. The Funeral Consumers Alliance. Funeral consumers, eh? Really? I'd love it if I could escape this role of consumer for once in my life, or very least, once and for all, once I'm dead. The Funerals Consumers Alliance has got to divorce their identity from the corpse's role as a consumer. Thank you, Ralph Nader. In the 1960s, the identity of a consumer may have been empowering. But here in the 21st century, I'm suggesting that our own identity as human beings is far more liberating. How about this? This is my suggestion. You can think of your own, but my suggestion is calling this group the Alliance for Engaged Human Impermanence. That should be the topic of the next board meeting. As I know, it actually has been a topic of many board meetings from this group struggling with this issue of consumerism. Human beings being born, living life, and dying as humans being. We may end up as patients now and again, but there isn't a thing about living and dying that's made easier by defining your role as a patient. A patient undergoing treatment for an incurable cancer to improve their quality of life. Now, we'll return to that concept a little bit later. But to improve their quality of life in the last remaining year of their existence may end up having appointments for 20 doctor's visits, 40 lab draws, 20 x-rays or scans, 4 emergency room visits, possibly 1 or 2 acute hospitalizations, maybe a trip or 2 to San Francisco or Palo Alto for a second, third, or fourth opinion. The cost may be $500,000 or more. Untold hours spent in waiting rooms. Untold hours spent on hold with insurance companies, patients' accounts, rescheduling appointments, releasing records, arranging second opinions, gathering results. Untold hours. Not to mention trying to figure out how to share the rapidly changing medical information with all the people in your life, all the people that want to know, how are you doing? And they've bought in, maybe with you, to the idea that the answer to that question must lie somehow in the volcano of medical information that is ever erupting. If we remember to ask you, your body probably experiences up to 6 symptoms, maybe more. The biggies are pain, breathlessness, fatigue, anxiety, and weakness. This role of patient in our current cultural context and frame have almost nothing to do with you as a person. Let's just say you spent your whole life a mechanic, a teacher, a mother, a writer, a cop, a doctor, whatever. In the years before this new job, being a patient, you probably identified with your role, and that had a lot to do with how you saw yourself in the world around you. And you stepped into that role and learned how to embody it. I assert that that's not who you are really either. But knowing that you are a mother, or a teacher, or a doctor helps a lot in organizing your strategy for successfully playing that role. Knowing that you are a patient doesn't help a bit, unless we think that obedience, poverty, overwhelm, resignation, and suffering characterize a successful strategy in navigating life and death. By the way, how are you doing? Human beings being born, living life, and dying as humans being. Human in the sense that we ourselves, with self-knowledge beyond the biology of us, we are born into barely adequate, developmentally incomplete, and dependent bodies. These newborn fetuses are a terrible excuse for a functioning organism. And yet everyone, anyone, can tell just by holding a newborn that this newborn is quite a bit more than the drooling, pooping, crying, searching little body that barely contains it. We can feel their selves, can't we? And they reveal themselves quickly, don't they? My daughter revealed herself as smart, funny, and determined, stubborn, by the time she was a week old. My son, he plays his cards a little closer to his chest, and he still does. Well, then they get their feet underneath them. They start walking and zipping themselves up in their human suits. And then we start to forget. We start to forget that as they start talking like us and caring for themselves, we might notice the amazing transformation of the body and mind that we call development, though we somehow miss the significance of it. That we are not our bodies and our minds. Humans are meta, beyond physical. Human beings, being born, living life, and dying as humans being. Human in the sense that we are selves that extend beyond the boundaries of our lives and intermingle with the lives of others. When it's all said and done, we actually are our families. Writ even larger, we identify with nations and churches and ancestors. We even give our lives to, and sometimes give our lives for, these larger structures that are formed by us. Like our alma mater, our nation, our army, our cause. Whether inspired by justice, like Martin Luther King Jr., kindness, like the Dalai Lama, or reconciliation, like Nelson Mandela, we actually become our family, our community, our tribe, and our nation, and our species. Is it the Raiders or the 49ers for you? Is it the Hutus or the Tutsis? It doesn't matter. It does matter, doesn't it? That one of us won the bronze medal in the women's single luge. Humans are meta, beyond individual. Human beings, being born, living life, and dying as humans being. Human in the sense that ourselves together through the evolution of biology, the propagation of history, the aggregation of knowledge, and hopefully the accumulation of wisdom, we humans can extend our influence beyond the constraints of time. You know that monarch butterfly migration from Central America to the California coast? It takes 6 months. And it took my daughter asking me how to realize that I had no idea how it could be possible for bugs, albeit beautiful bugs, to make that journey. These butterflies, they live only a month. It takes 6 generations to fly north. 6 generations to fly south. Every year for 45 million years. That's 540 million generations flowing northward and southward. I've got a calculator. The certain central essence of their being, their DNA, seems barely to blink at its passage through a certain monarch. It barely pauses to munch leaves as a caterpillar or turn itself to disorganized goo in a chrysalis. Although the DNA does seem to flaunt its glory with gorgeous wings and vast quivering masses, colonies of tens of thousands of butterflies, the DNA always has its eye on the prize of survival and elaboration in an unbroken chain reaching outward and upward, northward and southward. The unfolding history of our human family over this 1 million year blink dwarfs my own flights of fancy, and my own flights of hubris. Over and over, while I melt my wings by flying too close to the sun, the march of human history marches ever outward in time. Humans are meta, beyond, temporal. Human beings, being born, living life, and dying as humans being. Human in the sense that our very existence is so mind-bogglingly improbable against the backdrop of a world that is at least as spectacularly beautiful as it is freaking impossible and unfathomable. I realize I'm getting a little doughy-eyed and Carl Sagan-y on you, but come on. What are the odds that this conglomeration of star stuff flung outward 14.5 billion years ago arrives right here in the form of me hanging out with you? Seriously. I can hear their voices. Douglas Adams, Carl Sagan, David Attenborough, Jacques Cousteau, Joseph Campbell. They've showered us with their amazement that comes from prying their eyes open to simply observe the circumstance of our existence without needing to tell us why. I, for one, am in love with the unanswered questions. Given the scope, reach, and proportions of our circumstances, I am awash in beauty, paradox, and stunning wonder of our existence. Humans are meta, beyond mysterious. The first movement, my work. You recall the theme, don't you? Human beings being born, living life, and dying as humans being. I'd like to tell you exactly how I do my job every day, in every encounter. Herein lies the public secret of my simple approach to my role as a palliative medicine physician. With a little practice and a couple of sanctioning documents, you too could do this job. Let me introduce myself. Now that you are clear that we're all simply beyond, metaphysical, meta-individual, meta-temporal, and meta-mysterious beings called human. Let me tell you who I am. Now that I've deconstructed any falsely assumed identity you may have accumulated as consumers or patients. Now that I've introduced myself as just one of the many human beings being born, living life, and dying as humans being, it will make sense how I introduce myself to my patients as a doctor. For any of you that have been there, in the bed or at the bedside, this will be familiar. Hello. My name is Michael. Michael Fratkin. Dr. Fratkin. I am a father and a husband and a brother and a son. And I'm a couple of kinds of doctor. With one hat I wear, I'm an internal medicine doctor. That just makes me a so-called expert in the complicated illnesses of adults. But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because I'm a palliative medicine doctor. And what a palliative medicine doctor is, at least while I'm doing it, is two things. Number one, I'm very good at the treatment of symptoms. Pain, breathlessness, nausea, vomiting, whatever. I've got a really deep bag of tricks, and I know how to use it. So symptom control. The second thing that I do is that I help people and their families to navigate to make their way through what are sometimes very complicated situations medically, but what are always difficult situations. So symptom control and navigational assistance. And then I tell them how I do it. The way that I do this is really simple. First, I put my attention on the medical information and understand it to the necessary level of resolution. That's the history, the labs, the doctor's reports, the imaging, the pathology, the data. And then I communicate with all the other doctors and nurses that are caring for the patient to ensure that we're all on the same page. And then I understand the medical situation. And I do. I do understand the medical situation. And now I put all that aside. Because I know what you know about all this. Whether you know that you know or you don't. I put that all aside because what's happening here is not a medical situation. What is happening here is a human experience. This is your life. And I know almost nothing about you, about who you are as a human being living this life. So will you and your family take a few minutes to give me a sense of who you are and how you approach this life? Then they tell me, and sometimes I have to draw it out of them, but they tell me. And sometimes with what they say, and always with what they don't say, with words, and yes, with simply revealing themselves into the same level of trust inspired by some significant need to be understood in this vulnerable moment. Sometimes the spouse or the son or the neighbor draws attention to a defining characteristic, a signature flourish of individuality that orients my understanding like that to the who of this person in the what of their medical circumstances. And then I ask them a very, very important question. What do you think is happening to you? This is where the rubber meets the road, eh? This is where people reveal the strength or tenuousness of their relationship to reality. In my work, all my patients are facing their death with immediacy, and almost 2/3 simply answer, "I'm dying." Half of the remaining third acknowledge implicitly that they're dying while using indirect and sometimes pretty elaborate euphemisms, nearly to the point of obfuscation. But they can't fool me, the rascals. The remaining folks can't or won't look at the elephant in the room, and while I avoid pushing them beyond their capacity to see, these folks sometimes get mad at me. Go figure. Sadly, these folks tend to make terrible choices based on what they wish to be true. Terrible choices that cost them dearly in the form of avoidable suffering. It really shouldn't surprise you that people that are well related to reality tend to make better choices on their own behalf. That's no surprise, right? By the way, folks, what do you think is happening to you? Okay, one more question. Okay, that's true. You appear to have entered the chapter of your life that will end in your death. Given that, then what's most important to you? So they tell me. They tell me that they want symptoms and suffering to be avoided, prevented, or relieved. They most often tell me that they want to be home and cared for by those that love them and respect them. They always want to make sure that those that care for them and love them are cared for themselves. And if they have an acceptable quality of life, we'll return to that tricky concept. They would like to live a little bit longer if possible. Thank you very much. Some of these people want to roll up their practical sleeves and get busy completing their lives, from managing their business affairs to arranging their memorials and legacies. Others couldn't care less. Some people want to roll up their metaphysical sleeves and get busy resolving conflicts, embracing forgiveness, and inviting a healing process to occur. I love that stuff. But that's just me. I love that stuff, the healing of human lives. Even though such healing requires the high temperatures and high-pitched emotions and high-wire acts of bravery that characterize engagement with dying. I love that stuff. Even though I sometimes get singed from the heat of projected anger or pressed by the weight of unimaginable sorrow. I get baffled and frightened and blown away, horrified, inspired, disgusted, humbled, and amazed by the healing of human lives. I love that stuff. And I'm glad it happens as a rule, not an exception. I find that hopeful. Don't you? It's personal, isn't it? These human beings being born, living life, and dying as humans being. Second movement, your work. Human beings being born, living life, and dying as humans being. Beings being born, then human beings being made by living life and dying as human beings. Beings being made human by living life and dying as humans being human. Humans being human in the hugest possible sense of the idea that is so much bigger than that word, human. Human being in the most mysterious sense of that idea that is so much bigger than the word being. Human beings in the most collective and vastly amazing truth that our identity is meaningless without each other. Can it be that wellness is just the absence of pain or other symptoms? What do we mean by the quality of life? Is wellness something that we need to believe characterizes us and quarantines us from others over there that have illness? Is the quality of our life dependent on our competence, independence, and autonomy? Is wellness the result of a perfect exercise plan? 3 times a week for more than 45 minutes at better than 80% of the maximum predicted heart rate. Does that buy me wellness? Is the quality of my life at all dependent on its length? Is wellness swallowed or choked down with difficulty with handfuls of proper supplements and vitamins? When will I measure my quality of life? Is wellness a statistical target? If we only narrow the measurements of our blood pressure, body mass index, and cholesterol, do I hit the bullseye of wellness? Ready, aim, fire. Yoga 3 times a week, cleansing our colons every second Tuesday, sitting in meditation every morning, eating more kale, eating less sugar. Can somebody please provide me with a roadmap to this wellness so I can join my fellow humans in being in struggle, avoidance, resistance, and obsession with the concept? I'll pay. I'll pay a lot for the workshop, the retreat. I'll give a lot for the 4 Noble Truths, the 7 Factors of Enlightenment, the 8-fold Path, or the 12 Steps. Or has wellness become another commodity, an economic exchange, another Faustian bargain with the mainstream medical model or the economic institutions of the complementary medical model? Do we really have to trade our soul to play the role of consumer, patient, or doctor? Snake oil is snake oil, folks, no matter whether the salesman has diplomas on the wall or Ganesha on the altar. Whether you smell antiseptic or patchouli, you might ask yourself, what are you really looking for? Why are you there? What troubles are you trying to smooth, soothe, and salve? Some of us have discovered that wellness is not something I have and they don't. It's not that mental or physical wellness is over here and then mental or physical illness is over there, or vice versa, that wellness is over there and illness is over here. If you care to express yourself as broken in a world of others that somehow seem to enjoy wholeness. But don't look too close at the ill, or you may see their wisdom. Or don't look too close at the well, because certainly you will see their madness. Is wellness here or there, really? What does wellness mean to you? Does wellness mean normal? I'm always amazed when I see people with incurable illness lower their bar. It's very common to see people strive with all their dwindling vitality for normality, or rather, a terribly pale facsimile of it. Some of us just want to be able to sit up and watch crappy TV and pretend that they have all the time in the world to ignore this living. It's not what we're looking for that drives us towards desperate low-yield therapies. It's what we're desperately looking away from. We seem to me to be looking away from our dying while we're experiencing it. We seem to me to be looking away from our dying while we're not experiencing it. We seem to be looking towards various tricks, smoke and mirrors, material acquisition, sleight of hand, influence, snake oil, control, and tons of drugs. These tricks that never really reveal anything meaningful. There's no wisdom in avoidance, is there? The effort to look towards the truth of our mortality is called grief. I'll say that again. The effort to look towards the truth of our mortality is called grief. Our individual willingness to look towards the truth of our mortality is our personal grief. This personal grief is our wrestling with existence. This personal grief is how we make ourselves human. This personal grief is how we create the meaning of living and dying. Where do we find the meaning at the end of life? That's the wrong question, according to a new friend and teacher, Stephen Jenkinson. The question assumes that meaning is lost or hidden, that it's something defined or held under lock and key by those well people, I suppose. What if meaning is not hidden or something to find or elusive? What if meaning in life and in death is something to be made? Now I'll quote Stephen Jenkinson from a short little film that I hope you get a chance to see. I'll quote him because I can't improve on his words. What if meaning is made by the willingness to proceed as if certain things must be? Like life has to continue. Not you have to continue. That life is not your lifespan or your children's lifespan or the lifespan of what you hold dear. How about holding dear the fact that nothing you hold dear lasts? How about holding that close to your bosom? That's making meaning at the end of life. The willingness to do that. It's death that feeds life. It's the end of life that gives life a chance. What has to die is your refusal to die. Your refusal for things to end. If that dies, life can be fed by that. Coda. Recapitulation. Human beings being born, living life, and dying as humans being. Beings being born, then human beings being made by living life and dying as humans being. Beings being made human by living life and by dying as humans being human. Thank you. So the question goes to what is the current sort of consensus understanding of what palliative care or palliative medicine is? You're right on track. That really a palliative contribution to any medical care across the spectrum of illness, whenever there is some distress or discomfort or symptom, is relevant. So say for a kid with an external ear infection, to put the Aralgin in there to make it more tolerable, to make the pain go away, that would be to palliate that symptom. And that's a part of pediatrics. As you move closer towards incurable or terminal diseases, well then it's more having to do with the end of life. And just the way that my work is framed as a hospital-based palliative medicine doctor, quite often I'm working fairly close to that last part of life. And mortality is almost always in the space for the patients it's always in the space for the patients that I see. So some of it just depends on the structures within which you work. But your question actually about the word palliation leads me to something I cut from the talk that I will share with you. And again, I mentioned Stephen Jenkinson in this talk because he's had such an impact on me in such a short period of time. But he, in one of his talks, talk about where the word comes from. Does anybody know where the word to palliate comes from? It's relevant to this particular group, and that's why I wanted to put it in. But it comes from the same root as pall, like to cast a pall, which means to shroud or obscure with a sort of gloomy quality to it, to suppress or cover up. And he talks about palliative medicine and talks about end-of-life medical care as having sort of just three moves to, what does he say? I'm trying to remember. I can't remember. I'm not going to massacre his quote. But basically, to cover up, which reflects a little something about our model of what a person expects, to where we'll suppress consciousness to suppress symptoms. And there was a time when about 99% of human beings walked the earth where we had no specific, very potent pharmacologic tools for that. And people's view of what was expected or what suffering was at the end of life is a very different thing. Like for us, we keep people alive such a very long time. They certainly are fortunate we have potent medications to suppress symptoms. But actually the natural course or the natural history of some of the illnesses that probably killed people before we had so many of those potent tools had their own mercy built into the natural history of those things. So it's provocative. Good question. So do I have to explain myself or convince, or how well received does this point of view, well, how does it land for people? I used to be amazed that it didn't always land, but now I'm kind of amazed that it almost always lands for people. And I think that I've opened it up and shed more light on the nuances of how I feel and believe and think philosophically and psycho-spiritually around these issues. I don't burden my poor patients with that at the bedside, but that section, my work, how I introduce myself, in some ways feels like a hypnotic induction. I repeat it, I have it refined, I can presence myself. I couldn't just read it as a script and have it matter. You probably noticed, or I noticed in here, it's the place where I most dropped in presence in this room, is that section, because I've said it so many times, and it's not that just saying the words. I really am a husband and a father and a son and a brother. And when I bring people into recognition that that's really how I'm arriving, most people get that. They know they're not just a patient. So the question is, in relationship to a really well put together Planet Money piece on La Crosse, Wisconsin, and their community attitudes around end of life. This is not La Crosse, Wisconsin. This is Humboldt County. And we have all the possibility, potential, and opportunity with the native qualities of this community to do more and different than La Crosse, Wisconsin as it relates to advanced directives and conversations about the wishes that people have. There is vast opportunity to learn from La Crosse, Wisconsin. So the question is, can I share any advice for a family that has to engage in those conversations but is having trouble getting started? Yes, that would be my family, and your family, and your family, and your family. I am not free of the death-phobic culture. Yes, the advice is to start having those conversations. I had the good fortune to do something called a death cafe. Is anybody in here familiar with that concept? Yeah. So a death cafe was dreamed up by a bunch of English people, and it's essentially a couple of hours with tea and cakes, not a support group, not a encounter group, but just a conversation around issues around death and dying. You have a host who makes sure there's cakes. Cakes seem to be very important on the website. And then a moderator, and that moderator doesn't have to be somebody like me or Virginia, that's somebody that's, immersed in issues of death and dying. It has to just be somebody that's willing to keep people on track and make sure nobody sucks all the air out of the room. You don't need to have any experts. In fact, you're probably better off not having any experts in the room. But I did one of those with College Christian Fellowship, the Methodist Fellowship, as a kind of a little experiment, and it was really fun.
Can I just just like to invite people to remember that you don't have to wait till the end of life to have these conversations. I spent several years as a grief support facilitator over at hospice, and I have these conversations with my 8-year-old all the time. We have 3 canaries and a goldfish in our freezer that she has not gotten quite ready to let go of. And she occasionally visits with them, and she says, you know, can we take Ruby out and look at her, or such and such. And I feel really passionate about that because she is becoming a stronger, more present human being by not being afraid of that, by being able to have the space and the presence to be aware of death at the beginning of her life, that it's there, that it's present, that the glass is already broken, and to cleave to one another now, not when it's too late, so to speak. So.
Yeah, right on. Right on. Yeah, does she have Timothy Leary's head in the freezer too? Is that some other freezer? Tim Leary's head? No, that's some other freezer. Let's go all the way back.
Yeah, I have 2 questions. If the lady in the window could give those of us who don't know what group or what conversations that she's referring to, which are happening that are so incredible right now, way to find out about that. That's my first question.
The group that you
Yeah, good.
I'm sorry, this was just a gang of people.
Just grab a gang of people.
I wanted to talk about advanced directives. It's purely self-centered. I wrote a squib and said if somebody else would like to. I'm a member or have been a member of this group here, the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship. It wouldn't matter where, any bulletin would have done. People call me up and email me. That's how it happened.
Okay, it's not ongoing.
Yes, it is ongoing, but that brings me to the second piece of this, is that I think our group, the group of us that happens to come together, did at one stage very quickly on decide that there is a limited number of human beings in one room discussing stuff that would work. I don't know if there was any magic number, but we certainly decided that when it was 8, that probably that was fine.
Well, as a kind of I'm kind of new, but getting some chops at some community organizing. So, are there 5 people in here that would be interested in engaging in a conversation with that woman with the handkerchief on her forehead related to these issues? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Would you please make a point of bringing her your contact information? And then it's a conversation that's happening. Good.
So my difficulty in when you're talking with all of your family, because people live in different areas, so trying to get everybody on the same page. If something spontaneously happens, then there's always, it's heated to come together, even though you've had the discussion with several different family members. Just any suggestions on?
Oh, it gets crazy. Crazy. It gets crazy.
Bring it down to a level because of the emotions and the grief that's going on.
Oh, yeah, but there's no general rules. Like when families are coming from many different perspectives and things are all heated up, and it's the end of the day, if I could run into that burning building and salvage anything, an old photograph, a kitten.
To the same level, so
The point is that people here think that I think that what's missing is that it might look like that I'm an expert in issues related to dying. But my whole point here is that stuff takes care of itself. If you live your life, and you show your family, and you participate in your life, those kinds of things resolve themselves. Don't worry about that. You'll thrash your way and fumble and bumble your way through your crazy family at the end of the day. That's then. Right now is your opportunity to understand what it means to be a living human being. That's my point. I think that we'll take one more and then we'll let it go.
Real quick, with the lady by the window, be willing to moderate first 2 or 3?
She says no.
Oh, you have it right in your hands. I don't want moderation. I was late. Whoever you are, please.
There we go. Actually, let me just take this one more here. You had.
I'm curious about sort of follow-up to the last, although
Boston is a little bit further beyond us. What's the rest of the world? The rest of the world. So if we're talking about, my brother who lives in Bakersfield, what can I expect down there for medical? I mean, my father at the end of his life had someone who was amazing, who said, yeah, you've had a good life. You don't want to keep taking these pills. And another doctor who was furious when he said, we don't want to take these.
Yeah, I have no idea what's happening in Bakersfield. I honestly don't have any idea what's happening in the next exam room over, where the other person, and frankly, beyond taking the opportunity to teach and to speak and to share what I have found to be true, I can't take responsibility for that. I will continuously speak and call for a higher level of humanity in the care of people who are suffering from medical illness or approaching the end of their lives. I will continue to do that, and that's my only way, but it's not my expertise to understand what's happening over here, over there. Right now I'm going to the American Academy of Hospice and Palliative Medicine for the first time in 6 years. I'll be going next week, and I'll learn a lot. But I've been pretty isolated, just learning from my patients and their families and my environment up here. So there are other people who probably know more about trends and things, but not me. I think I'm going to have to call it good because we're running out of time. I am absolutely willing to talk face-to-face and personally with all of you. Thank you so very, very much.